Welcome back to the next segment. In this segment, we're going to look at creating a table in SQL. So when we're creating a table, there are some naming conventions, some rules that are in place to what we name our tables and our fields. I'll go through a lot of these. The first one being that they cannot include any of the SQL, SQL, or Access reserve words like select or from, where, things like that. The names cannot exceed 64 characters. You can use pretty much any combination of letters, numbers, even spaces, and most special characters aside from the period, exclamation point, and the square brackets. Table and field names should not start with a space. You should really just avoid using spaces altogether when naming your tables and fields. It just makes it a lot easier. You can use spaces, but there's some extra work that you need to do in order to do that. So it's really just better to avoid it altogether. You can use the underscore. If you want to separate words, it's easier, or it's better to use an underscore instead of a space character. So typically you'll be able to use both upper and lowercase. It's best to use what we refer to as camel case, where you kind of capitalize like the first letter of each word, especially since you're not going to be using spaces and things like that. It just helps to better identify it. So there's some information as far as naming conventions go. So when we're creating our table and then we set up our columns, we need to associate a data type to each of our columns, to each of our fields. And so here's a look at some of them: auto number, currency, date, so on and so forth. And so the list on the left, the lowercase one, the one that's not in parentheses, those are the data types as you'll see them in Access table design view. But when you're actually writing your SQL statements, you're going to use the terminology that's inside of the parenthesis. So something to keep in mind there. And so just remember that when we're creating our table and our columns, we're not creating data inside of it, right? We're just creating the shell to hold data. So that's why we need to assign, the type of data that we're going to put into it. After it's all created, the table's created, and we have all our fields created, then we'll start populating the table with data. And in Access, that you do it through that data sheet view when you have your table open. You have your two different views, data sheet and design. And so design is doing just this, what we're talking about right now, setting up the table and the fields, designing it essentially. And then the data sheet field is populating it with actual data. But we're going to be using SQL. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So got my Access open up here. So I'm going to come up to Create, Query, switch this to SQL View. So I'm going to get rid of the select statement because I'm not actually doing a query. I'm going to create a table. So I'm going to say create table, and then we're going to provide it a name. I'll just call this table items, and then we're going to open up a set of parentheses. And so inside these parentheses are going to be all of the fields that we're going to create for our table, kind of similar to our shorthand notation. Kind of best practice is to indent the fields underneath the table. You don't have to. You don't even have to do it on separate lines, but it just makes it look cleaner and easier to understand. So we're going to provide a field name, a column name. I'm going to say item ID, and then we're going to provide the data type for that field. So this one, I want it to be an auto increment one. And so, this auto increment data type, I kind of talked about this a little bit in a previous segment in regards to surrogate keys, where we need a unique value to identify each entry within a table, each record within a table. And so a common way of doing that is using this auto increment field if we don't already have something in the table. So we can create a new field, give it this auto increment data type, and then as we populate data and create new records inside the table, this field, the item ID, will just automatically increment to the next number with each record that we put into it, so giving it a unique number. So that's super helpful. So we'll say that I'll create a name field. This one will be text. So with this one, a couple different texts that we can use. Text like this, and then inside the parentheses you specify how many characters you want to allow for that field. With this field text, we can have a maximum of 255, or if we need more than that, we can use long text. So this is just the name of an item, so I'll keep this to around 35. And then I'll just create one more field, name it price, and then we'll call it single, and single is just basically a number field, and the single kind of refers to the amount of memory that is used to store numbers. So we have things like single and doubles and things like that, and then we can also use number fields like integers and long integers and things like that. So that's good enough for now. To separate each field, we're going to need a comma, and then at the end of it, we're going to need the closing parenthesis, and then a semicolon will close off the entire statement. So that's what, kind of a create table statement looks like in SQL. Again, it doesn't have to be formatted like this. It just looks kind of cleaner and easier to understand when doing this. So now, if we look at my tables category, we see all the tables that we have there for the JC Consulting. Now when I run this, it should create this new table, and there it was added right there, tables. So if I open that up, I'm now in datasheet view. I got my item ID, name, and price. If I switch this to design view, there's the fields and then the data types that I assigned to them. And so you can kind of see how the data types in this view are different than in the SQL statement, right? So I used auto increment, text, and single, but here it's auto number, short text, and number. So it's a good idea to kind of get familiar with those data types and how they associate between design view and SQL view. So there, we just created a table with SQL. We wrote our first SQL statement, creating a table. So that's pretty awesome. So good. That wraps up this segment. We'll see you in the next one.